Does somebody give me a green light, or do I start? If nobody says they're going to give me the green light, then I can't wait for the green light. So here we go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeremy Hildreth of Jeremy Hildreth and Comrades. I'm a veteran advisor to leaders of cities, countries, and companies on brand strategy and tactics, and I'm the moderator of today's session. I'm glad to welcome you here in the Beijing Hall of the Moscow Urban Forum 2017 to the premiere of Parag Khanna's book, Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. The book's thesis is that humanity has a new principle, connectivity as destiny. We are moving to a situation where national borders and conventional geography matter less and less, and connectivity, so-called, matters more and more. Parag has been studying these phenomena both from the ivory tower and at a ground level. Indeed, one thing you must admire about Parag, and perhaps a reason to trust him more than some others on the conference circuit, is that he really has first-hand, direct experience of the world he writes about. He's a traveler first and foremost, and an intellectual and a scholar second. He's also a political scientist and a consultant on the development of megacities, and now the author of part 3 of his trilogy on a changing world. The last time I saw you, Parag, we were hanging out in Singapore. The time before that was in London.
Yep.
And the time before that was down a back alley in Shanghai.
That's right. And
here we are in Moscow. So it's good to see you again.
We've got to stop meeting like this.
Yeah. So, amigo, it's good to see you again. Now, tell us all about connectography.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you all for being here. For those who were not at the opening plenary this morning, I've made a selection of a different set of slides. There are one or two that overlap, but this gets a bit more into the foundations, maybe, of the argument. And I'll just spend a couple of minutes on it so that we can just have a conversation about the topics and, of course, how they affect Russia more generally and Moscow in particular. So let's see if we can fire up the slides. Can we get the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. So here we go. This is one that I did show this morning. So, you know, the premise is that it's not just, this morning I was focusing on the last generation or two of infrastructure investment. But the point that I make in the book is that actually if you go back not just a couple of decades, or even a couple of centuries, but millennia, literally millennia, what you find is that our technological capacity, if you're familiar with the work of Ian Morris, by the way, Ian Morris, the historian at Stanford, he's British, he wrote this great book, Why the West Rules for Now. And in that book, he coins this term social capacity. So what I'm modifying that a little bit, and I say, you know, it's the technical capacity of civilization allows us to build ever more lasting, almost permanent infrastructures. A lot of things that were built in the past, like Roman roads or, you know, Ottoman roads, even some British era railways are crumbling and collapsed. Today we build these very durable fiber optic internet cables wrapped in titanium and laid down on the floor of the ocean. Today we're building you know, cities and towers that could stand for centuries, barring any natural catastrophes, and these high-speed railways and so forth. These are very durable infrastructures, and they are so they have such longevity that, in a way, if you look at the functional cartography, in other words, the map of infrastructure, and you compare it to the map of nations, you would find today that while nations are falling apart, literally destroying themselves, succumbing to civil war, and disappearing as they are in the Arab world, there are infrastructures on those same territories that were built before those countries were born and exist after those countries have disappeared, right? So there, in the book, there are maps that show you pipelines that cross the terrain of Iraq and Syria that were built in the early 20th century. So before you had anything called Iraq, before you had anything called Syria, you had these functional infrastructures of natural resource flows, physical infrastructure. But our maps, the maps that are in our offices, the maps that are in our classrooms, the maps that our children learn from, are always political maps. It's always this presumption that the map of political division is a natural state of being. But in fact, countries are born and die all the time. And that's my job as a political scientist, actually a political geographer is my kind of more formal training, is to look at that evolution over time. And we have 200 countries in the world today. Now, of course, we're sitting in Russia, let's bear in mind. So the collapse of the Soviet Union 27 years ago is, one of these seismic events of the 20th century and really of world history, where so many states were created. Political geography is a zero-sum game. When one country is born, that means another country has lost something. It happens pretty much every single year. East Timor didn't exist until 10 years ago. That means Indonesia got smaller, right? South Sudan was born a few years ago. That means Sudan got smaller, right? Kurdistan is having an independence referendum in September of this year. Iraq is about to get smaller, right? We have changes in political geography all the time. There's nothing permanent whatsoever about states. And of course, for better or worse, Russians ought to know this and do know this. Whereas these fixed infrastructures that we're building are far more long-lasting. And that's why I showed this earlier today, talking about functional geography. I'm not saying that the state is disappearing, not at all. Actually, my argument is that we're going to have more and more and more countries because we have more and more devolution. I hope that some of you heard Ken Livingston today, the other Ken, former mayor of London. He gave a brilliant speech earlier today. And the word that he used at least 5 times in his speech, if you heard it, was devolution. Devolution, devolution, devolution. This book has a 100-page section just on devolution. The idea that it is by far the most powerful political law of history. More powerful than democracy, more universal than democracy, and more life-changing in terms of governance. More powerful than democracy is devolution. It's the idea that power is constantly in a situation of entropy. It is always flowing outward towards further and further units, towards smaller and smaller units. And so Ken Livingston's argument was cities need to have more power, cities need to have more authority, cities need to have more fiscal capacity, all of those things. And that is, in fact, what is happening all over the world. As the number of countries increases, it means that more and more empires have split up. In the United States today, as you know, there is a revolt against the federal government, against Donald Trump, against the White House, against this sort of ad hoc governance of the country, whereas cities are saying, we know what we're doing. We know what our immigration policy should be. We are for trade agreements, right? All of these things that they're saying where they disagree with the White House. That's an example of devolution. The local authorities want power. The whole world is experiencing this. Democracies are experiencing it. Non-democracies are experiencing it. Again, 70 years ago, there were only 50 countries in the world. Today, there are 200. It is not arguable that devolution is the single most powerful political force in history. There is no argument, right? We don't have universal democracy. We do have universal devolution. So what happens, though, in the logic of history is that the smaller and smaller units get, the smaller and smaller the countries are, and the more and more we live in cities, how can a city, how can a small country survive on its own? How can it have autarky? What are the things that human beings need to survive? You need food, you need water, you need energy. Can a small country or city provide those things for itself? No, of course not. So the more countries you have, the more cities you have, the more units you have, the more you desperately need more connectivity, because you have to transfer resources more and more. You have to transfer food from one place to another place. You have to transfer fuel from one place to another place. Water, even. And if you're just living in a very small country, right? And again, we have more and more small countries than we've ever had before. Again, it's ironic, obviously, to discuss it in Russia. Russia is a little bit smaller than it was 25 years ago, but it's still the largest country in the world. But you import lots of things, right? And you also export lots of things. The survival that I'm referring to is also economic. What if you were the only consumers of your own energy, right? Well, you'd be bankrupt because you wouldn't be paying enough for it as what the rest of the world pays you for it, right? So we cannot survive without connectivity, large countries or small countries. There is no survival without it. And so the functional map really becomes as or more important than the political map. I briefly put this up today, and I just want to show it again. I think that for the next 25 years, this is the single most important map you could ever look at. I mean, this is the most important map of where we are and who we are as a human species, because every human being is on this map. Notice that most maps in your classrooms and offices don't show people, right? It's always about countries, but as if the world population doesn't matter, only the size of a country matters, but of course that's not true, right? So here you have a map that actually shows people, and where people are matters a lot. And if you look at the migration of people over the last 60,000 years, you would observe that mankind is a coastal, urban civilization, mostly located in Asia, right? That is a factual statement. It is not true that we live in sovereign, equal nation states, right? Russia and Congo are not equal in their power in the world, right? But what we are, for sure, is a coastal, urban species, ever more so, mostly located in Asia. And this is a permanent fact. The other thing that the other map that I think is going to be very significant in the next 25 years is this one, because as I said, most of the world's population lives right here, and that will always be true. Your children, your grandchildren, 150 years from now, most of the world's population will still live here, right? And we are here on this map, just about. But 2/3 of the world's population is here. And all of these lines that I've drawn in, the oil and gas pipelines and railways and so forth, there's going to be electricity grids. All of this is going to be built in the next 20, 25 years. A lot of it is financed by China, other countries, and so on. So this One Belt, One Road that you have been hearing so much about has really been happening for 25 years. Since the Soviet Union collapsed is when China began to make these investments. You might have heard about it for the first time 2 months ago or 1 or 2 years ago when the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was founded, but it's been going on for 25 years. 25 years. I've been traveling in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia for at least 20 years. Jeremy, I don't know if you know this, my friends call me Paragistan, because when they're looking for me, chances are I'm in one of the stans. So they call me Paragistan. And I've been watching these projects. Now it will be bigger, it will be better, it will be more. It's going to reorganize the space within which most of the world's population lives. So that's just a really quick overview of some of the arguments of this book that, lucky for you, is only 500 pages. When I submitted the manuscript, it was about 1,200 pages. So we've slimmed it down a little bit. It only weighs 1 kilogram now. But with that, thank you again so much for having me. I really look forward to our discussion today. Over to you.
Thank you, Parag. And if nobody told me to start, no one's going to tell me to stop either. So let me check we've got 15 minutes to keep things on schedule. So I was thinking, what is the vision of this world? Because what we're seeing a lot of going on now is the tensions between the disjointedness, the increasing disjointedness between the functional map and the political maps. Is that fair to say?
That's a good question. Is it really disjointed? So what you're probably referring to is sort of, the so-called anti-globalization movements, nationalist movements, Brexit, and so on, right?
Well, I think there's different ways that emerges, but I suddenly got the vision sitting here of what the future might look like 100 years from now, which would be more countries than we have now, that would join and occasionally exit and rejoin a little more shifting levels of confederations
Yes.
at a sort of EU
Yeah.
level. Which brings me to a quite concrete question, which isn't something like Brexit, which a lot of people were caught off guard by and thought was the end of the world and all this stuff. Actually something that, for whatever its merits, one way or the other, exactly the kind of thing that we're going to have to get used to if human beings are going to thrive over the next 100-200 years.
Absolutely. So I think that when we talk about devolution, secessionism, nationalism, things like Brexit, we act as if when it happens, that's the end of some process. It's actually the beginning of a new process. So let's take two examples. Brexit. So as you rightly pointed out, they surprised even themselves by doing it, and now of course they regret it. But point being that when a country cuts off some aspect of its connectivity. Now when a country loses some connectivity, let's say you're North Korea. North Korea has exactly one internet cable that goes into the country. And when it's cut off, everyone loses internet. So you start to realize, you start to appreciate connectivity because you've just lost it. Now, what happens when you voluntarily cut off your own connectivity to something? So that's Brexit. And then everyone starts to Google, what is European Union? I was in London the other day, and I was at one of those pret-a-manger cafes, right? And my friend pointed out to me, the price of a muffin has just gone up, 20 pence in the last X amount of time. Why? Well, because suddenly the cost of some ingredients, the importers have already started to jack up prices in anticipation of Brexit or something like that. But
plus the pound has dropped.
Right, and the pound has dropped. So once you voluntarily, accidentally cut off some connectivity, you realize, oh my goodness, what have I done? So I am not surprised that 6 months after the Brexit vote, Theresa May gave this big speech at Davos at the World Economic Forum, and the title of the speech was Global Britain. Where isn't there some disjunction between an idea of a country saying we're going to Brexit, we're going to take control of our sovereignty, and then coming out saying global Britain? These seem to be antithetical, but it's not, because Britain has realized, oh my goodness, we are in fact statistically one of the world's most open economies, most trade-dependent nations, largest recipients of foreign investment, and now we have done something that is going to be self-destructive. Let's overcompensate. Let's go out and tell the world we're open for business. We need to be connected. Let's go out and negotiate 700 new, trade agreements, services agreements. Go out and recruit foreign investment, because they realize, oh my goodness, we might be losing some connectivity. And anytime that happens, by and large, it's a bad thing for you. It may be a good thing, if there's a global digital virus, some cyber hack that is going around the world and rapaciously destroying, software systems and stealing, financial information, and you are lucky to be spared from it because you're North Korea and none of your banks are online. But 364 days a year, whoever you are, wherever you are, you're better off with more connectivity rather than less.
Just sitting next to you is sort of inspiring ideas in me. And I'm remembering a course I took as an undergraduate about urban stuff and optimal size areas for provision of services like garbage collection, ambulance, and police. And they were the realization was they were different, and they didn't necessarily match the political boundaries of the municipality. So I guess we're going to that's the stuff we have to figure out. And something like negotiating trade agreements, it's going to turn out that the optimal service provision level for that is going to be something EU-sized, 20 or 30 countries in a bunch doing it, rather than one country.
I'm glad you brought this up. This
right?
is kind of my favorite niche literature in the field known as New Economic Geography, which I urge everyone, some of you may still be young enough to be in school or graduate school, but go do a PhD in kind of New Economic Geography. This is actually a useful academic field, unlike a lot of other fields. And they work in this area of optimal service areas. And what you find validates your point about regionalism, or at least sub-regionalism. The Nordic areas are a great example. What the Nordic countries have done with telecoms, banking systems, they share in this service area. At the sub-state level, you're finding that countries are creating new agglomerations. Look at what Italy is trying to do with new metropolitan regions. Look at what China has done. China has 30 provinces politically, and each of those provinces has very unique, distinctive histories, even dialects and so forth. But even though they have these 30 political provinces, China is becoming basically 26 to 28 mega urban cluster regions. And that becomes the optimal service area. Transnationally, without a doubt. So you can't just measure it in terms of the, let's say, the division of labor or comparative advantage in economic provision of goods, saying, in the European Union, at least, some countries do industry, some do agriculture, some do energy, some do finance, so you've got this nice thing. You also have to think about in terms of the external benefit beyond just the optimal internal service area. What I mean by that is Europe benefits not only through the internal integration, but the power projection. Because when you are a large common market with a common currency, you have a lot more leverage than what any one country would have. So there's an optimal service area and there's an optimal geopolitical area as well. For the United States, very interestingly, it is North America. Now, when we look at North America, we think of, well, the US is the sort of hegemon, and, Canada and Mexico, they don't really matter. But the autarky that North America has in natural resources and in labor and many other areas owes itself to its North American-ness. The fact that it's a North American country, because America doesn't have readily available fresh water supply in the fastest growing parts of the country. The southwest of the United States is dry. Think of the deserts in Las Vegas. The reservoirs are going down. There are droughts, right? But Canada is the most water-rich country in the world alongside Russia, right? Lots of fresh water, very few people, right? Actually, Russia has 140 million people. Canada has about 30 million people, and they're about the same size, right? So where is American water need to come from? And where will food be grown in the future because of climate change? And where are young migrants coming from to work as America ages? Mexico. So the optimal service area, the optimal economic area, the optimal geopolitical area, even for the United States, which is a superpower, it's still more than itself. It's something bigger, it's regional, it's continental.
And that's good, because that means more NHL expansion teams,
yeah.
and more jobs for Russian elite ice hockey players to go to North America, which would bring us into immigration, which would be a whole other kettle of fish. I'll just ask one more, and then if we have time, I'll go to the audience. A lot of people today regard themselves as anti-globalists. What do they mean by that? Or what do you think they mean? And in what ways are they actually right to be suspicious or concerned or angry, and in which ways are they just completely out to lunch?
The concluding chapter of this book begins with exactly this. I wish that anti-globalists knew what globalization was, because if they did, then they could probably make a more educated assessment of whether they are for or against it. And the more you know about globalization, the less anti-globalization you become. The fact is that the term anti-globalization took hold in the early 1990s when there was a spate of trade liberalization agreements, and it was perceived that these were privileging Western corporate interests over third world interests. It was a North versus South dichotomy. We don't really live in a world of a North-South dichotomy anymore. We live in a world of an urban-rural dichotomy and a rich-poor dichotomy within countries. So you may know this fact, but the Gini coefficient in the world, worldwide, between the richest and the poorest countries is shrinking, but the Gini coefficient within countries is growing. And so the anti-globalization protests movements of a decade ago, 15 years ago, have disappeared. Today, when people say anti-globalization, what they are really saying is that they are against their own government's mismanagement of globalization, right? Because most countries have managed globalization pretty well. That's why incomes are rising, development has accelerated, right? If you look at the famous elephant curve, which I talk about in the book, the elephant curve shows you that over the last 25 years, 90% of the world population has gained, has experienced very significant expansion of wages. If you took the whole world as one country, right, and you broke it up into deciles of income, 9 of those 10 deciles have experienced very significant expansion of wages. There's one particular decile, and it happens to be the 80th to the 90th decile, that has not done very well at all. It's still increased a little bit, and that happens to be the more or less the Anglo-Saxon, you know, a part of Western Europe, labor force, right? It has gained, but it has gained less than others. And that right there is your so-called anti-globalization movement. So those are the people who voted for Trump and voted for Brexit. Now, to vote for Trump or to vote for Brexit does not mean that you're anti-globalization. It means that the British government and the American government have been doing a very poor job of managing their economy, their fiscal expenditures, and their trade and investment policies. The fault does not lie with globalization. The fault does not lie with China. The fault does not lie with Mexico. The fault lies in those governments. So when a government gets voted out for mismanaging these things, perhaps they deserve it. But let's be clear that it was not actually a vote against globalization. It was against a government that messed up its management of globalization. And that, quite frankly, is unforgivable. I, too, would vote against those governments because there are many countries in the world in the last 2 decades who have watched outsourcing happen, watched labor automation happen, and they have responded actively. They have retrained their workers. They have prepared their citizens for new industries. They have evolved their educational systems. Korea has done it. Switzerland has done it. Germany does it. The fact that America has failed to do it is not the fault of globalization. It's the fault of Washington.
So on that note, I mean, this is a book. If you want to understand these things, this is the book that's really going to give it to you good and hard. And there's great stories in there that I'm really impressed with, of how you really, you know, like paddling around in a kayak around the slums, like the fluid slums of Lagos.
That I don't recommend.
And I mean, you really do your research. Like, you're not just looking at statistics. You're looking at statistics and you know, comparing it to what you see around you every day. So you can buy the book just out there. Will you sign it, or are you like Will
Happy
Chamberlain,
to.
no autograph? No.
No.
It's always nice to have an autographed copy of a man's book, so I recommend you do that. And 15 minutes from now, in this same hall, the official study of MUF 2017, entitled Agglomerations, World, Russia, Moscow, will be presented, covering practical proposals for the Moscow agglomeration about investment, infrastructure, and city management. So run out, get a book, come right back for that. Thank you, Parag, and thank you, audience.
Thank you very much.